evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this special edition of News 5 at 6. I'm Rob Quirk, along with my co-worker, Renee Skinner, a reporter here on News 5. We appreciate you joining in for this community conversation. We feel it is something that is essentially important to keep the conversation going in this community across Southern Colorado and this country regarding race, racial injustice, community policing, law enforcement. What is going to continue to be made, what steps will be made in a positive direction moving forward as we continue to try and facilitate change during these very difficult times. We feel like we've got an excellent panel for you here tonight. Let me introduce those folks who are joining here this evening. To my immediate left right here is Justina Ramirez. She is a radio talk show host with Blazin' 98.5. To her left is the police chief of the Fountain Police Department. His name is Mr. Chris Heberer. Sorry, Chris, about that. I can't read my own handwriting. Up on the second level, we have Representative Tony Exum from Colorado Springs, represents the 17th Legislative District here in Colorado. Dr. Stephanie Rose Spalding to his left. She is the UCCS Chair of Women's and Ethnic Studies, also a longtime activist here in Colorado Springs. And finally, to her left, Colorado Springs Police Chief Vince Niski. Thank you all for taking time. We had to postpone this earlier because of COVID concerns, but we're back. We're all social distancing. We're going to try to do our best to get as many questions in as we can as we try to tackle these important issues that affects our community here in Southern Colorado. And I want to start out with all our panel members with just a general question to really set the tone for where we believe we are as a community. And that question is, and I'll begin with Justina, where are we today as a community in your view in terms of where we've come and where we need to go? You have 45 seconds.
We're unsettled, we're uneasy, we're untrusting. We have a lot going on within the communities that just by conversations that we're having now, I think would be resolved. Again, going into the communities with the police officers and the relationship we have with them in certain areas, again, you know, we can improve on it. But as of right now, it's tense in all areas.
Thank you. Chief Heberer, your views from the Fountain perspective.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having us here tonight. You know, I'd like to begin with saying, number one, I mean, we're all here tonight, right? So that's a huge positive step. I mean, you know, Tony's here, you're here, Doctor, you're here, you know, Vince behind me is here. You know, we're all here tonight to talk about this conversation, and all of us came at our own free will and volition. So I think we're going to talk about a lot of very important topics tonight, topics that are at the heart of what's going on in the country, certainly in our community. You know, for me, personally, professionally, you know, I was born and raised here in Colorado. You know, this is my state, this is my community. I love our country, right? I served in the Army, so I think we got some work to do, and we're gonna talk about it. And I think, you know, when we say, and I could say as a police professional, that we have room to improve and we want to improve, both Vince and I are here, both Vince and I and our peer groups, we talk about the very issues at heart today. I think we're gonna talk tonight, hopefully in a very respectful, honest, transparent way, and we can all, and you know, at some point, sometimes it's okay to disagree in our country, and sometimes that gets lost, but the dialogue is important, the understanding is important, and I feel very blessed to be here, so thank you.
Chief, thank you. Representative Exum, where do you believe we are today as a community, at least from a short-term perspective?
Thank you, Rob. Just a couple of things. First of all, I agree that we're here discussing, which is good. We need to continue the conversation. But what my concern is that there's assumptions made by the police, there's assumptions made by the community on how the police should respond, should interact with the community. And those assumptions, when you make assumptions, then you don't have conversations, you don't communicate. The community is expecting the police department to protect and serve. And then the police department is expecting the community to respect the police department, respect the uniform, without having conversations about that. So when something happened, like what happened in my district, there was assumptions made that this is going to happen, that's going to happen, and the communication stopped. And the community got defensive, the police department got defensive, and there was no communication.
And we're going to get into that a little bit further, a little later in our show.
Thank you.
Dr. Spalding?
I think we're extremely fractured right now, and I'm grateful that you have us here and that everyone did show up this evening for this conversation, because there's a lot of tension that's happening, particularly in Colorado Springs, but not limited to Colorado Springs. I would say El Paso County and beyond in Colorado. And honestly, I want to say, because part of your question was where have we gone, we're way past conversations. We've been talking for a long time, and we're at the point that people's lives are on the line and we need to move into action. So again, when we think about where this particular community is, we are past the point of let's continue to sit down and have conversations.
It is about action indeed. Chief Niski, your perspective, sir.
My perspective, our community is divided right now. I think there's still a portion of the Colorado Springs community and the El Paso County community that supports law enforcement, supports what we do, understands what we do. I think there's another part of our community that is concerned about law enforcement, and I think they're concerned, rightfully so. I don't think we have done a very good job of communicating with our community, educating our community, and listening to our community. I do think, though, I would agree with Representative Exum that communication is a big part of healing and recovery.
All right. Thank you all. We're going to get a little bit further into some of those specifics a little bit here in just a minute. We need to take a commercial break. You're watching a special edition of News 5 at 6. We'll be back after this break. And welcome back to this special edition of News 5 at 6. I'm Rob Quirk. Our next question from my colleague, Renee Skinner. Renee?
That's right, Rob. Well, 8 in 10 African Americans say racism is a big problem in American society, and about half of whites say the same, according to the Pew Research Center. And the question that I would like to pose to our panelists is, what do people not of color fail to recognize when it comes to empathy and understanding of other cultures and other ethnicities?
Representative Exum, let's begin with you. You have 30 seconds.
Thank you. I think the biggest problem is that they're not listening. They don't appear to want to learn about other cultures, and they make assumptions about how people should react, how people should feel, and in order to help move beyond this, is that you have to appreciate and value someone else's culture, and if you value someone else's culture, you're going to be willing to learn more about what they do.
Let me move to Dr. Spalding. So it is about education. In fact, when I was speaking with some of the demonstrators downtown this year, they were saying, I need to re-educate myself, and these were people of all color, about understanding empathy for others. Your position as far as reaching out and making a conscious effort to empathize and understand other cultures for those who don't understand yours.
A lot of it has to do with relationship. When we think about the demographics of this city, when we think about the demographics of this state, in Colorado Springs, we're about 4 to 6% African American, and my students would say, "Oh, I have a lot of black friends," and I would be like, "Am I it?" Because statistically, that cannot be possible in this city, that you would have that kind of depth of relationship across the board with people. And so you can't develop the empathy and the respect and love for a culture that you aren't engaging with consistently.
Justina, you have...
Roundabout, same type of scenario where if you don't have the proper education or, understanding, you go into the whole situation with an already established opinion, which, necessarily is not always the right one, as we see going in relationship with the police and building in our communities, that I have to agree with Stephanie, just the knowledge and then going out and being involved. We have to get involved and take some responsibility within ourselves as well. Go get involved in what's going on in the community. Go find out what's going on, that they might have volunteers at the police station or different types of things as well. Just opening, a gap as well in understanding.
Chief Niski, do you, since the minority community is of a smaller percentage here in the Springs, how much responsibility do you take in making sure that your primarily white force understands the ethnic diversity of our community?
Regularly on diversity. We try to have our officers socialize with members of the community, socialize in a sense of during calls for service, talk to people, try to learn about people, try to learn about different learn what's important to them and what's not important to them. We really do try to mirror our community as much as we can. And I think what we have to do, though,
I'm going to have to interrupt you. We're having a mic issue with you. I'm going to jump quickly to Chief Eber. Go ahead and same question because you have the same issues in your police department as well.
Well, sure. I want to say first and foremost, look, you hit on two key terms. Number one is empathy. Number two is compassion, right? Compassion for people. You know, my experience growing up in a small town here in Colorado was not very diverse. You know, it goes to your statement, right? In my high school, we just didn't have a lot of diversity. You know, I was very blessed to be part of the melting pot experience in the Army for 20 years, and that greatly broadened my horizons, shaped me. I did understand, right, the first time I was in Fort McClellan, Alabama in the 90s, that it was different, right? It was my first experience outside Colorado, and things were different. So last thing, I'll just answer that question, and this is what I always try and remind my cops, and I would remind everybody here listening. In all of our lives, if we're honest, 3 degrees left or right, your life could look much different. That, to me, goes back to compassion. I realized by the grace of God and some other things, some luck and favor, that my life what it is today. But I also realized 3 degrees, certain things don't work out quite right? My life could be much, much different. So we really try and educate our officers on that, right? And dealing with the public, regardless of the race, having compassion, and you can still take someone to jail and not strip their human dignity as a person. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we got your mic situation straightened out. We're going to have to take another quick break. We'll be right back. Again, not a lot of time. We're going to get as much as we can and stay with a special edition of News 5 at 6. And welcome back. I'm Rob Quirk. Thanks for staying with us for this special edition of News 5 at 6. We want to pick up with Chief Niski with our next question. The Devon Bailey shooting, polarizing in our community, still polarizing. All officers involved clear of wrongdoing, but what would you say to those who still protest his death? What do they not understand about what happened despite the conclusion of that investigation? You have a minute, sir.
A lot of people that have questioned me or talked to me about the Devon Bailey, the first question I ask is, have they looked at the grand jury report? It's about an 8-page report that explains a lot of what citizens heard in a grand jury hearing. It's a report that explains why they made the decision that they did. I think what people need to realize is that those 2 officers acted under the color of their authority and acted under the color of the law that was Colorado law. They acted appropriately. They were exonerated by a grand jury. They were also looked at from the Department of Justice, and the FBI looked at the case as well. And they also said that the officers did what they should have done or what they could have done under the color of their authority and under the color of law.
Obviously, there's a different perspective. Dr. Spaulding, could you please just address from your perspective the concerns that you have raised throughout the course of this controversy?
I think sometimes it's easy to hide behind the color of law and the color of authority. As a professor of women's and ethnic studies, I can tell you plenty of times in the history of the United States where the law allowed for some things, but it wasn't righteous. So it doesn't mean that's always right. And that is what this community is calling out to CSPD, as well as the El Paso County Sheriff and the mayor, city council, and everything else. When we think about the loss of Black life, Colorado is leading the country, is very high in terms of officer-involved shootings. There is a problem, and there's a problem that we need to correct.
Renee, you had a follow-up question? Go ahead.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask some of our panelists, how do decisions like the Devon Bailey ruling affect how people perceive police, how they interact with police going forward after that investigation wrapped up?
Representative Exum, what have you been hearing from your constituents to that regard?
Thank you, Rob. The things I've been hearing is that what was in place, although they had the authority to investigate each other as far as the sheriff's department investigating the police department, what I'm hearing is that there was no, very little trust in that investigation, because the police chief is now the undersheriff, was in charge of the investigation, so they lacked the credibility to do the investigation. Whether or not there would have been a different outcome with the FBI doing the investigation, what I'm hearing from my constituents from the community is that they feel like it was what was handed to the FBI was already determined, and there wasn't a third set of eyes that should have been on that because of the close relationship between the sheriff and the police
And
department.
we want to talk a little bit later about some of the perspective we've gotten on an independent review of these kinds of law enforcement involved shootings. We're going to try and get to that later. We need to take another break. We'll be right back. And welcome back to our special edition of News 5 at 6. I'm going to turn to Renee Skinner now. A question that is happening in another city, but it affects all of Colorado. Renee, go ahead.
Absolutely. In my hometown of Aurora, the use of the drug ketamine has come front and center after the death of Elijah Mclean, who, of course, died. Now, Chief Niski and Chief Heber, I want to know, what are your agency's stance on the use of the drug, and how do you feel about the lead up to Elijah Mclean's death?
Well, man, I mean, look, every death is tragic, right? We can talk about Devon, we can talk about this one, we talk about everything that's going on in the country, right, regardless of color. But I'm just going to tell you, every death is tragic. You know, ketamine and mind-altering drugs, right? I'm not a medical examiner, but I have some experience. And, right, you know, we study and we train on excited delirium, right? We see the signs, we see the impacts. Both Vince and I, our guys have Narcan, and I can't tell you how many guys we've saved, people in our community we've saved because of different kind of drug overdoses that Narcan brought them forward. So, but anytime an individual is taking some, you know, the first time I heard about ketamine was in the 90s, and it was new at that time, it wasn't heard of, right? But the risks are very grave, right? And at some level, that person's making a decision that could have an impact negatively on the rest of their life. So, look, I don't want to be cliche, but just say no to drugs, right? And we try and train our kids in our community. We have the DARE program. We have all those things, right, to help prevent that being a contributor to a tragic outcome for a family. And I'll send it to Vince.
Chief Niski, is that something that you believe should be a tool in your toolbox in these types of circumstances, the use of ketamine?
Well, it's not a tool in law enforcement's toolbox. That's a medical decision that paramedics, whenever they arrive on scene, they're the ones that administer drugs. The only drug, like Chief Heber said, that we use is Narcan for opium overdoses. We do carry that. We have saved lives. We don't make the decision to administer ketamine. We don't carry ketamine. That is something that when either the fire department or paramedics show up from AMR, they're the ones that make a decision on how they want to try to help bring a patient down and sedate them. We don't carry it.
One thing we have heard now from the Aurora City Council is banning the use of tear gas and those kinds of things. That is something in your arsenal. How do you stand on that? Do you feel that's a proper weapon, if you will, or?
It's a non-lethal weapon that we utilize during protests and demonstrations that become violent. I do think it is a way to disperse crowds. I would argue that it is a tool in our toolbox that we do need to retain and we do need to keep so that we do have less lethal resources available to us to disperse large crowds.
And in that vein, Chief Heber, about tasers, the use of them is a first choice for law enforcement in a life and death situation. Where do you come down as far as that should be the priority first?
Well, you know, I think, you know, the Colorado state law that Tony helped do is, you know, a House bill. We're analyzing the House bill, and it talks about use of force. And you know, we train through de-escalation. We train through lethal force, and that's what Vince is talking about. We want our officers to have all the tools on their Batman belt that they can go to based on the scenario before they get to lethal force. So whether it's verbal persuasion, whether it's tear gas in a riot that our peaceful citizens, our peaceful protesters could get injured. We've recently seen that on the news, right, where people were shot during a protest that got very violent, right? The taser, the non-lethal, the taser takes, you know, a 5-foot person that's 100 pounds and puts them on an equal playing field with a 300-pound person. Right? Because when you get 2 taser probes, it's very effective. And generally, in my experience, this is not a perfect science, but you know, when the taser comes out and deployed, and you can watch a million videos on YouTube on it, it ends the situation, and the cops are able, in most cases, to get control because the taser, is having been tased once before, it was a powerful deterrent. I showed it to all my nephews and told them, you see the taser, you know, stop. So that's my answer.
Okay, Chiefs, thank you. We have to take another break.
always watching out for you. This is KOAA News 5 at 6:30.
And thanks for staying with us for News 5 at 6:30. I'm Rob Cork as we continue our community conversation about so many issues that are facing our community here regarding social justice, law enforcement activity, etc. Just the interaction of our communities as we move forward and try to make positive change. I want to kind of turn the mirror on myself as a member of the media in both what we do and what we see on social media. And I want to get a perspective from our panelists about the juxtaposition of things that we see. On the one hand, peaceful demonstrations. On the other hand, the other side of the split screen, people are looting and robbing and burning down businesses in the wake of the George Floyd death, etc. I'm going to start with Representative Exum, if you could first. What do you feel needs to be changed in terms of the role that we play in representing what we hope will be the facts of a situation?
Thanks, Rob. I think a couple things. One is that the follow-up on the original message or the original case that you were talking about, to follow up on that, because what happens is that when the people are seeing the peaceful demonstrations, but then the split screen, like you say, when they see the robbing and looting, it takes away from the message that the peaceful demonstrators are trying to present.
More context on the differentiation between the two, although they are converging in the same story.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Spalding, to you, ma'am.
I'm going to ask that the media actually be objective and tell the same story. When we look at what happens to Black life that is taken from us, from our community, immediately we go to character assassinations of the individual who is dead. And then we find individuals like this man in Kenosha, the 17-year-old who is not characterized as a man, who crossed state lines, who committed crimes by being 17, having a gun. We find him, washing graffiti off the wall. This man is a murderer. And tell the same story about white people that you tell about Black people.
Consistency. Justina?
Same type of scenario where right now there's a disconnect. The social media and what's going on in the community is completely off balance. I work in radio. I have everyone in the community coming in, and to put all back respect where it should be focused, Devon Bailey was actually the situation that opened up the can of worms, I feel like, in Colorado Springs for a lot of us to go in and start acknowledging the police, brutality and the injustices. And you have to understand too, being in all fairness, yeah, technically the grand jury said that they were right. They were right in the shooting, but compassion and empathy that you talked about, was that enforced with the Bailey family? And a lot of the community's upset about that. It's just the way we get treated, not necessarily the laws. A lot of people break a law and be okay with it. I did it, but it's the interaction after that.
But to the point about, and I'm going to move on to our next guest, we only have so much time. Chief Heber, about what you see from local news and national news, do you make a distinction, and do you feel that a good job is being done by our part?
I appreciate the question, but the one thing that I think we would all agree on, there are powerful forces at play, all trying to divide us, our country, races, right? There are powerful forces at play. It's social media and the invention of social media. I tell most of my cops, it's the devil. Right? Because it does more harm, the narratives gets changed. I appreciate local news. I think, generally we do a fair job, but, if you go home tonight and you watch CNN versus Fox News, you're going to have two different narratives on the same story, and they're going to be absolutely opposed and separate.
So people need to be more intelligent about how they watch.
They do. Where we're getting our news from, I would say, in educating ourselves, right, and get the facts so we can all make informed decisions of how to change, right, based on facts and what the roadmap looks like, I think is important, and one of the pillars that's at the heart of the matter of what we're discussing tonight.
Chief, thank you. Thank you all. We'll be right back. And welcome back. We want to talk about some things that have changed in the months since the George Floyd killing. I'm going to turn it over to Renee Skinner. Renee?
That's right. I want to pose this next question for Chief Nitzke. Chief, I want to ask you just about the things that you see that are improving in our community. There has been a commission that has been created, a lot of talk about police accountability as well. So I just want to get your take as far as what things do you see are improving in our area?
I think there's been a lot of steps started. I don't think I've seen a whole lot of improvement, though, immediately. I think there's, at the police department, we've created a leadership steering committee that we've been meeting with, but it's been a slow process. We're trying to better communicate with members of our community to reach out. I think with the council's accountability commission, I haven't been involved in that process. That's strictly a city council. I'm hoping that the police department will be involved once that is a seated commission, because I think it's hard to evaluate if we are doing things right if you don't know what we're doing.
Is that frustrating to you? Let me just jump in, that you're not a part of that process right now. It seems like you should be, since you're the focus of the accountability committee.
You know, I'm really not frustrated with it. I'm not. I know we're the focus. I'm confident that we'll be included in the discussions. I'm also confident that when that commission starts comparing us to other organizations our size throughout the country, they'll see that we fare pretty well. That we do look at our policies, we do look at our practices, we review them all the time to make sure that we're keeping up with best practices across the country. So I'm not too concerned about not being involved. I'm just hopeful that we are involved once it's seated.
Chief Eber, real quick, about 45 seconds. Senate Bill 217, we've seen implemented is now the law of Colorado. Sure. Some significant changes, banning chokeholds, fleeing suspect changes, body cameras for mandatory now for police officers.
Yes.
Positive change in your view?
Yeah, look, you know, I'll be the first one to tell you that law enforcement's not perfect, and we need to continue to improve, right? Every organization in America would say their organization needs to improve, right? We have 600,000 cops in our country. There's always going to be a couple bad apples, but generally those men and women go out and put their life on the line and defend their communities, and with their life, right? It's not words, right? It's their life on the line. Let me highlight a couple of things. Body-worn camera, mandatory in the state of Colorado. Awesome, great. Transparency, accountability. It does me as a police chief more good to look at any incident or incident complaint and use that as a tool to get the facts, a tool, right? Not the smoking gun or whatever that is. It's a great tool. Number two, lots in the bill about holding bad cops accountable and post-decertifying them. Absolutely good with it, right? None of us, especially me and Vince, want bad cops in our profession because it hurts and damages relationships with the community. Failure to intervene, like what happened with George Floyd, which is tragic, right? People should intervene, right? We have in our policy, regardless of rank, anytime, everyone has a responsibility to intervene, and transparency. So it's good. I'm not saying it's perfect. And also I'd like to highlight last year, Tony might be aware of this, but now our internal review reports are accountable to the public. Right? So in the old days, maybe a police department could take their internal affairs review and chuck it under the table. That's not possible now.
All right, thank you. I got to take another quick break. We'll be right back. And welcome back to this special edition of News 5 at 6. I want to pick up where we left off before the break with Representative Exum and the development of Senate Bill 217. We heard from the police chief about what he thinks are positives come out of that. Are you satisfied as a lawmaker who helped put this together that we are moving in the right direction and this is actually going to give some teeth to the issues of transparency, accountability, thinking before law enforcement makes a move?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Just to follow up on Chief H's comments, I believe that the bill is in a good place. It started out a lot of pushback. There's 25 plus amendments on the bill where AGs were involved, DA's office, the chief of police were involved. And overall, this is going to increase the integrity of police departments throughout the state because they're going to, like the Chief H said, or Chief Nitzke, neither one wants bad actors on the job. This gives them the opportunity to deal with that. And it protects other departments from bad actors if they get terminated from moving around the state. So I think the bill is in a good place, and again, it's going to increase the integrity. One of the
pushbacks from local communities is the cost to them when it comes to having to payout in litigation for some of these officers, in addition to what they may have to pay if they're found guilty of violating personal rights or committing a crime. Is that something that was hotly debated in the state legislature, and is that something that could financially strap our communities from a taxpayer standpoint?
No, I don't think we're going to have that many cases. It's going to hold the officers accountable, and it states that that the community that feels like they were not treated fairly can hold that officer accountable for his or her actions through I think it's up to $25,000.
Right. So in the long run,
I believe it's
fair. You feel it's fair.
Absolutely.
Renee, I'm going to move on back to our social media discussion and some of the things we've seen from law enforcement that have really upset the public. Please, go ahead.
Absolutely. Well, recently, Spring Sergeant Keith Reed was reassigned after saying on a Facebook post, quote, "kill them all," when referring to demonstrators who blocked traffic along I-25 back in June. Protests in the wake of that incident were held, and protesters said that that officer should have been terminated, not just reassigned. Chief Niski, I want to pose this question to you. What do you have to say to those residents who say that that action didn't go far enough?
I think there's a misunderstanding across the country about law enforcement that I have the authority just to fire somebody. I don't. In Colorado Springs, we have due process rights for our employees. Our employees are also protected under civil service. I think Representative Exum was actually a member of our Civil Service Commission years ago and sat on that. So he understands that we don't have the authority just to come up and I say you're fired. We have due process. We looked into that situation. We had an investigation done. I'll be the first to say that was a stupid comment, idiotic comment. I've made statements before that our employees sometimes are their own worst enemies, and they impact the department and the vision of the department and our relationship with the community. We just didn't feel that he meant it when he said it, that he is going to be a problem in the community when he serves the community further in his career. He is a 20-year veteran of the Colorado Springs Police Department. He's been dedicated to serving this community, and we just didn't think that his statement was something from the heart.
Dr. Spalding, jump in there, please.
I am baffled by the response and even the protection of the kind of response. This individual, 20 years or not, deliberately set up a separate Facebook account. So that's premeditation, right? Because he did not want to be tracked and traced with his comments. And so when you say that he has served the community for the last 20 years, I ask the question, am I not the community? Because I'm one of those protesters. I'm one of the people who are consistently showing up and resisting what kind of lack of leadership that we have in this city. And to have that protection demonstrates the disconnect that we have, the lack of trust, and why we continue to have a lack of trust across the board in this city.
And then, Chief, a lot of people made the comparison to what happened in the Elijah Mclean instance in Aurora, where the social media posts the photos of the officers making fun of that scenario and equating it, and that was immediate action of dismissal up there. And they look at this situation as just as egregious. Obviously, the due process is being given to those who have challenged that situation in Aurora, but I think that's the thing that is confusing to people, and they don't understand what the difference is and why that kind of punishment wasn't handed down here.
And again, I can't speak for Aurora. I don't know if Aurora is a civil service police department or not. I don't understand. I don't know their policies. I can tell you that across the country, I have seen where departments have fired people immediately the next day after they have done something, and I'm just not sure that that is going to stand. I'm not sure that those individuals, right, wrong, or indifferent, they may have deserved to be fired, but I still believe everybody deserves due process.
And one more follow-up question. Some of the pushback we got from viewers and online folks regarding that protest in the middle of I-25, forget about what the officer said on social media, saying that you didn't take action quickly enough to clear those folks off of I-25, and that in the grand scheme of things, you should have been more aggressive to act upon a protest in the middle of a major thoroughfare in this city. Fair?
That's fair. It is a fair comment. We were surprised by that protest. We knew there was going to be a protest downtown. We did not prepare to respond to I-25. The protest moved to I-25. We were preparing at the time that it happened, we were responding to a lot of priority calls throughout the city so that we didn't have patrol officers available to respond to that. We were putting together other resources within the department to respond. By the time they got coordinated and a coordinated effort prepared, the protesters left.
Thank you very much. And again, I apologize. We are out of time already. That hour went really fast, and I know we didn't get as many questions as we want, but I want to let our broadcast audience know that we are going to continue online at all our social media platforms. But at this point, for our broadcast audience, Justina, Chief Eber, Chief Niski, Dr. Spalding, Tony Exum, thank you all for joining us. Sit still. We'll be back in just a few minutes, and we're going to send you to primetime programming, but the continuing discussion on our online platforms continues right after this.